Stories abounded among sailors of the monsters that stalked the distant ocean. One sailor had even reported seeing a sea snake that put his head on high and snatched away men. Over 60 days since they left Spain, Columbus's crew are suffering from the hardships of life on the open sea. The food is rotten, and the stench below decks has driven many of them to sleep in the open. The situation on board is ripe for mutiny.
The account of Columbus's voyages are peppered with references to mutineers, to the sailors not trusting where they were going, not trusting that they were going to come back. Clearly discipline was a real problem.
Finally, a band of sailors demand that Columbus turn the ships around and return to Spain.
They knew that they had reached a point beyond which, if Columbus was right, they should have seen land. And this led them to believe that perhaps Columbus's great idea was totally wrong.
But in a final gamble, Columbus holds off the mutineers by convincing them to back him for just 3 more days. After all, they've spotted vegetation in the water, a sign that shows land should be near. And it seems tantalizingly close. An eager lookout reports land ahead.
Tierra! Tierra!
But it turns out just to be low cloud. At last, on the 3rd day, Friday, October 11th, 1492, Columbus does see land, just in time to save him from all-out mutiny. The following day, he goes ashore.
At dawn, I went ashore in the ship's boat. Armed, I unfurled the royal banner and the captains brought the flags.
The flags bearing the standards of the monarchs of Spain claim the new world for a European power. Believing himself to be in the Far East, Columbus calls the islands the Indies. In fact, he is on the edge of a new continent, the Americas.
Gloria al Padre, al Hijo, e al Espíritu Santo.
After a prayer of thanksgiving, I ordered the captains to bear faith and witness that I was taking possession of this island for the king and the queen.
Yo tomo posesión de esa isla.
The entire company of the fleet bore witness to this act.
En nombre de los reyes de España.
To this island I gave the name San Salvador, in honor of our blessed Lord and Savior.
For many people, this is where the history of Columbus ends, with the discovery of the New World. But he will battle his way 3 more times across the Atlantic. Little does Columbus know in October 1492 that he is standing on the brink of his greatest and most challenging adventures. Ahead lie war, shipwreck, mutiny, and disaster. It will climax in his final Lost Voyage. Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic was one of history's greatest journeys of exploration. In just a few months, he changed the world map forever. But this wasn't enough for Columbus. He wants the New World to give him wealth, too, and he now sets about finding it. Zigzagging across the Caribbean, he is on the lookout for likely places to find riches and found colonies. One island shows most promise. In honor of Spain, the nation that's bankrolled his exploration, he names it Hispaniola. Today, it is the large island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. To Columbus, it seemed like paradise.
All these islands are fertile, and this one is particularly so. It has many large harbors, finer than in any Christian lands, and many large rivers. The land is high and has many ranges of hills.
Columbus hopes that the discovery of Hispaniola will prove to the world his talents as an explorer and win him a personal fortune from its natural riches. But the paradise he describes will lead only to short-term success and ultimately to disaster. In 1492, the island seems like a new world to Columbus, but it is far from uninhabited. Around 100,000 people are already living here. They call themselves the Taino. Columbus, thinking he has arrived in the Far East, the Indies, calls them Indians. The Tainos, who believe their gods arrive by sea, think Columbus is divine. What they don't realize is that these gods intend to exploit the island's people and its resources. Columbus wastes no time. Within days, he finds gold in Taino villages. It's exactly what he wants, a rich source he can plunder for himself and his Spanish paymasters. Leaving 39 men behind on Hispaniola, Columbus returns to Spain as a conquering hero. But for Columbus, the discovery of the Americas is just the beginning. He knows that to really profit from the islands he discovered on his first voyage, he has to make a second journey back there as quickly as possible. It takes him just 6 months to put together a fleet of 17 ships for his second voyage to the New World. This time, it will be different. More a journey of colonization than discovery. And it's a much larger expedition with ordinary settlers, royal officials, and gentlemen adventurers hoping to make their own fortunes alongside Columbus. For this second voyage, the Atlantic crossing is smooth and quick, taking a more southerly route than the first voyage. After just 24 days, they arrive in the Caribbean and turn north again towards Hispaniola. They anchor offshore at night, expecting to see the settlers they left behind. But the shore remains dark and silent. The next day, Columbus lands on Hispaniola again. But he finds that not only has his camp been completely destroyed, but all 39 sailors have been slaughtered. It is Columbus's first clue that settling on Hispaniola is going to prove more difficult than crossing the Atlantic itself. Columbus needs to find a new location to build a proper permanent settlement that can feed and defend itself. So he takes his ships 70 miles east. Here, 1 year after the first voyage, Columbus builds La Isabela. Today, Isabela is a ghost town. This is all that remains of what was once an impressive town of 200 settlers' huts, a storehouse, and a church. The largest house was reserved for the governor, Columbus himself. But Isabela was doomed from the start. This was a death trap. There was no fresh water and little protection from the elements. Located on Hispaniola's north coast, the settlement took the full force of the Caribbean's worst weather. Its open harbor was totally unprotected. Worse still, the surrounding area was covered with swamps, the perfect breeding ground for killer diseases.
The skeleton we see here is a Spaniard who died at the age of 37, most likely of malaria. He was one of the first settlers, and malaria was the most common cause of death at that time here in La Isabela. There were some other diseases like dengue fever around, but most of them really died of malaria.
Disease, bad weather, and hunger lead to the first signs of discontent among the settlers. La Isabela is clearly no place for a new city. Columbus travels deeper into the heart of Hispaniola. He heads for the region of Cibao, the source of the island's gold. But Columbus's decision to move inland will turn the native people against him. By now, the Taino realize that the Spaniards are here to stay, and they are clearly not gods, but greedy mortals. They start to fight back. Columbus responds with a fierce campaign of terror. The Taino are forced to submit to his rule. Columbus built a new city in the Cibao to stamp his victory on the land and people. In its time, Concepcion de la Vega will become the richest gold mining center in the Caribbean.
La Vega was an example of how the Spanish colonization was becoming successful. They pacified the Indians here and put them to work mining gold, and were able to spend that gold on Spanish products and to turn this into a European-style city.
It was here in La Vega that many of the nobles who had crossed the Atlantic with Columbus on the second voyage came to settle, driven by the ambition for wealth. The Indians had been happy with the tiny nuggets of gold they plucked from riverbeds. But the Spanish want everything they can get their hands on: nuggets, ore, and even gold dust. They stripped the island of its natural resources. Here at La Vega are the remains of the Spanish gold industry.
This is where the Spaniards would have the Taino Indian workers bring the gold ore that they had panned out of the rivers. They could clean it better here and then smelt it and mold it into gold bars that they then stored in the fortress until it was time to ship them back to Spain.
In March 1496, confident that his colony had been thoroughly pacified, Columbus brought his second voyage to its end. He returned home a wealthy man, the admiral of the ocean sea. But from now on, the fortunes of his beloved Hispaniola will take a completely different course. 2 years later, Columbus returned to the New World on his third voyage. This time his main aim was expansion and exploration. He sailed as far as Venezuela, making him the first European ever to set eyes on the continent of South America. Then the third voyage turned north. In August 1498, Columbus returned to Hispaniola and founded a new capital. He called it Santo Domingo. From here, he became governor of the whole island, at the heart of Spain's growing empire in the Caribbean. But Columbus, the master of the sea, is no leader on land. Here, his navigation and sailing skills are of no use. He needs to be a leader of men. His approach will be brutal. Any dissent from either the Taino or Spanish is met with violence, as Columbus rules by terror.
One of the things that Columbus did was cut people's ears, cut people's noses as punishment for thievery. And he did this both to Spaniards and to the native peoples.
The Plaza de Armas in Santo Domingo was the setting for many of Columbus's public mutilations. But turning his own people against him would prove to be his downfall.
Columbus's relations with the Spanish colonists were never good to begin with, and as time went on, they got worse and worse and worse. And the Spanish colonists on Hispaniola were not about to take this treatment lying down.
Eventually, a large group of colonists rebel and start setting up their own colonies in the mountains of Hispaniola.
Many of them wrote letters back to their relatives and friends in Spain complaining bitterly about the treatment that they were receiving by Columbus and about his governorship of the colony. And the Spanish sovereigns learned of these complaints and they took them seriously.
The alarmed monarchs send an envoy to report on the growing crisis on Hispaniola. The conclusion? Columbus is to blame. The man who discovered the New World is imprisoned in his own colony. He returns to Spain branded a criminal. But everyone has underestimated Columbus's ability to fight back. He will win one last chance to prove himself in the toughest venture of them all, his forgotten fourth voyage. Christopher Columbus made his name with the discovery of the New World. But this moment of glory has been followed by a dramatic fall from grace. But now, nearly 10 years after he first set foot in the Americas, incredibly, Columbus is about to brave the Atlantic Ocean again. This fourth voyage will be the most controversial and devastating journey of them all. Despite his mismanagement of the New World, despite his returning to Spain in chains, and despite his trial for atrocities, the King and Queen of Spain have forgiven Columbus. They've even agreed to pay for one final voyage. But this hazardous venture is being done on a shoestring.
It was a small-scale operation. He had bad ships, inexperienced crew. It was obvious that this was not where the Spanish monarchs were putting their priority.
The crew know Columbus is the most experienced Atlantic explorer in the world. But they also know that Columbus is a desperate man. His reputation and finances lie in tatters. This is his last chance to save his name and make his fortune. What's more, the Spanish rulers have changed their original deal with Columbus. Originally, he was going to control exploration of the New World, and he'd get to keep a large share of its profits. Now, all that has changed. The monarchs have given other explorers the right to conquer and colonize, and Columbus won't see a penny. Now, Columbus is yesterday's man. His writings capture his intense bitterness at losing out on the wealth of the New World.
I have had my honor and property ruined. Now, even tailors are asking for licenses of exploration.
On this fourth voyage, Columbus is traveling with his illegitimate son, 13-year-old Fernando, a former page at the Spanish royal court. Now he aspires to be an explorer like his father. Columbus still dreams of making his fortune, and he still believes that he can find the undiscovered westward passage to Asia. But Columbus is 51, an old man by the standards of the time. He suffers bouts of crippling gout and arthritis. Everyone thinks this will be his last ever voyage. His bold plans already sound as if he is attempting the impossible, to sail right around the world.
He really did believe God was speaking to him directly and had an important plan for him. He mentions in a letter written at the time of the fourth voyage that God had given him the keys opening up the Atlantic to new discoveries.
For this wildly ambitious project, Columbus has managed to handpick some key members of his crew. Diego Mendez has joined the fleet as an official clerk, but the fourth voyage will challenge him in a way he can never imagine. Columbus's brother, Bartolome, has also agreed to sail. He's a cartographer trained in Portugal's state-of-the-art Center for Navigation. But he has also been tainted by his time as joint governor of Hispaniola with Columbus, accused of much of the brutality on the island. But Columbus hasn't been able to choose his captains. They've been appointed by his financial backers. Diego and Francisco de Porras command Columbus's sister ship, El Santiago. The Porras brothers will undermine Columbus and destroy his reputation. Once again, on his fourth voyage, Columbus is relying on caravels for his exploration. This time he has 4 of them, each with a crew of about 30 men. Below decks, the hold is full of supplies, food, spare sails, and weaponry. On deck, there is all the rigging and sailing equipment, as well as cannons for defense and attack. Toward the rear is the steering area, below the raised quarterdeck, where most of the commands come from. The stern of the ship is curved at the waterline, the only way at the time to make it strong enough to withstand the power of the ocean waves. Fully laden, the whole ship weighs only about 100 tons, less than the weight of a blue whale. For 13 days, Columbus's flagship, the Capitana, with the rest of the fleet, carrying a total of 140 men, sails southwest along the coast of Africa towards the Canary Islands. Once again, Columbus has the latest ship technology and techniques at his disposal. The winds along the coast of Africa blow consistently from the south, so he rigs innovative triangular lateen sails that enable his fleet to sail at an angle towards the wind and to break out from Europe to the Atlantic Ocean. At the Canaries, Columbus's crews land to replenish their stores. They need to be fully supplied, because from now on, the fleet will be weeks beyond the nearest landfall. From this point, Columbus's maps of the Mediterranean and Africa will be of no use. But from his earlier transatlantic voyages, Columbus has unlocked the secrets behind the winds which blow across the ocean.
Some years ago, I learned that the westerly winds which blow year-round in the higher latitudes are as dependable as the easterlies, but in the opposite direction.
Sailing across the Atlantic is actually quite a straightforward process if you know your winds, because you can follow the northeast trade winds across from the Canaries, from Madeira, which will take you to the Windward Islands of the Eastern Caribbean. If you then move northwards, you can then follow the westerlies, which will then take you back to northern latitudes. So for your entire voyage round the ocean, you can always follow a circle with the wind behind you the whole way.
To take advantage of his knowledge of the prevailing winds, Columbus spends his time in the Canaries re-rigging his ships. He fits them with traditional square mainsails, ready to catch the wind which will blow from straight behind him, powering him all the way to the New World. The fourth voyage is Columbus's fastest crossing. Driven westwards by the trade winds, it takes just 21 days for the fleet of the Master Mariner to traverse the Atlantic. But after traveling so far, so fast, it suddenly seems that all that awaits them is disaster. Columbus, always alert to the elements, notices a strange change in the weather. He observes a calm in the air, abnormal currents and unusual cloud formations. It's a sign of a deadly Caribbean threat. To Columbus, it can mean only one thing: a hurricane. He has already lived through a hurricane on his second voyage. He knows something of their immense destructive power. The name hurricane comes from the Taino Indians, who had to battle them every year.
The Taínos called hurricane the evil spirit, but originally it was said Huracan was a god of the winds.
On average, the Caribbean is struck by a deadly hurricane with winds of up to 112 miles an hour over twice a year. When winds are over 70 miles per hour, a tropical storm technically becomes a hurricane and has enough force to smash a wall. At over 100 miles an hour, they can reduce a house to matchwood. A Category 5 blows at up to 150 miles an hour, hitting everything in its way with 11 tons of pressure. In fact, a single hurricane can contain enough power to fuel the world's energy needs for an entire year. In the 1500s, Columbus was one of the few Europeans who had experienced hurricanes before. Hurricanes at sea are particularly dangerous. Without obstacles, they can run freely across the ocean. Columbus knows that his fleet will never survive the coming storm. So he wastes no time sending a messenger to Ovando, his replacement as governor, warning him of the impending storm and begging for permission to land on Hispaniola. But Columbus knows he's going against the orders of the Spanish monarchs. They have only agreed to back the fourth voyage on the condition that he never sets foot in his own colony, Hispaniola, again.
By the time Columbus arrived at Hispaniola, his name was mud among the Spanish colonists. Nobody liked him. Everybody remembered his cruel and tyrannical rule as governor of the colony.
But Columbus has no choice. He desperately needs a safe harbor as refuge from the approaching storm. His messenger returns with the terrible news that Governor Ovando won't allow them to land on Hispaniola. Nobody on land believes a storm is coming. For Columbus, it is a devastating blow. He will now have to rely purely on his skill as a sailor to survive. Realizing that the hurricane is veering north of Hispaniola, he navigates his ships in the opposite direction. He anchors them in a sheltered bay, which he hopes will give some protection from the full force of the hurricane. As night falls, the hurricane strikes. The raw power of the ocean overwhelms them, tearing each vessel from its anchorage and scattering them out to sea. Columbus later recorded the terror of that night.
The storm was terrible, and on that night my ship was broken up. Everyone lost hope, and was quite certain that all the rest were drowned.
Eventually, the terrifying storm passes. Columbus and his ships have survived. By sheer luck and brilliant seamanship, they are able to regroup in a cove prearranged by Columbus, their ships relatively unscathed. But not everyone has been as lucky. Hispaniola's capital, Santo Domingo, is completely obliterated. 29 of the new governor's 30 ships and 500 lives have been surrendered to the sea. But Columbus still doesn't have permission to land on Hispaniola. So the exhausted crews have no option but to head out into the open sea. Columbus may have survived the storm, but now he and his tired fleet are set on an irreversible course into the unknown. It is the beginning of the Lost Voyage. Columbus left Spain on his final lost voyage over 50 days ago. He and his crew are lucky to be alive.
Y el Señor de la verdad y la Santa Trinidad. Bendita sea el alma y el Señor que nos las manda. Bendito sea el día.
Through good fortune and skillful sailing, the small fleet of 4 ships have survived the violent force of a hurricane at sea. But this amazing feat is merely the start of Columbus's lost fourth voyage. Many more dangers and extreme challenges lie ahead. Columbus has yet to complete his quest to find the westward sea route to Asia. He has yet to fill his holds with enough gold to make him rich. And he is yet to clear his reputation of the violence carried out in his name in his colonies. The fleet sets off again. They stop briefly in Jamaica to replenish supplies, then sail west along the coast of Cuba. Beyond that, they will be in totally uncharted waters. No European has been beyond here before. Columbus fears his crew may become restless. They've been refused a landing at the only Spanish settlement in the Caribbean, and there's no end to their voyage in sight. Ahead lie the fears of the open sea. But Columbus has a trick, started on his first voyage, to restore the morale of his crew. He describes it in his log.
To sustain their hope and dispel their fears of a long voyage, I decided to record shorter journeys than we actually made. I did this so that they might not think themselves so great a distance from Spain as they really were. For myself, I will keep a confidential, accurate reckoning.
But once again, Columbus shows his misjudgment as a leader. Tricking the sailors is only a short-term answer. Although the crew have no real idea of where they are headed, Columbus is still able to estimate his position at sea through a well-used navigational method.
Well, Columbus used something called dead reckoning. It's rather crude, but quite effective. And that involved measuring time using a simple device like this, an hourglass that was calibrated for half-hour intervals. Secondly, he had a compass that worked out the direction in which he was sailing. And thirdly, he worked out the speed at which the ship was sailing by counting the time that some object would float from the bow to the stern. And taking that information together, he would plot it on a simple board like this that would enable them to actually measure the course of the boat. And from that information, he got a rough idea of where he was.
Life on board follows a strict but relentlessly monotonous routine. Time is divided into systems of watches lasting 4 hours each. Every sailor is allocated a particular duty: scrubbing the deck, cooking meals, keeping a lookout, marking the hours, and maintaining the ship. But over 4,500 miles from home and often far from the sight of land, their only real comfort is religion, the hope that a higher power would safeguard their lives.
Dios te salve María, llena eres de gracia, Señor.
Conditions on board these tiny ships are extremely cramped and very unsanitary.
People didn't think bathing was a good thing to do, so just start there, and kind of work backwards. So the men slept on deck. They had their own sleeping mat. You go back to the bathing thing too. A large part of the ship's diet was things like garlic and the salted beef and wine and olives. Sanitary conditions being what they were, it must have been a very odoriferous crew.
Going to the toilet was not very easy either. You basically went over the side with it all hanging out. And it's a very uncomfortable and not very dignified way to do it.
But Columbus is a man possessed, and the condition of his crew is now inconsequential to him. He is determined to find the westward passage to the Orient at any cost. He believes that he had been very close to finding it before. On his first 3 voyages, Columbus discovered most of the islands of the Caribbean. Now, on his 4th voyage, he still believes that all these islands form part of Asia. He's still stacking up the evidence gained on his earlier journeys.
All throughout his voyages, Columbus was looking for animals and plants that somehow would confirm this idea that he had reached China. Every bird, every plant, every pepper, every spice, everything that he found that even remotely resembled something Asiatic was to Columbus brilliant confirmation that he was in fact right and had indeed reached East Asia.
Columbus's great goal on the 4th voyage is to find the mainland of Asia. Find what he thinks will be Japan and China and India. Seeking a way through, he sails down the Central American coast. He is the first European in history to map this territory. Along his way, Columbus has met many Indians who have told him tales of a place called Sigare and a vast inland waterway.
They also say Sigare is surrounded by water, and that 10 days' journey away is the river Ganges.
To Columbus, this sounds like the westward passage he has always believed in, a secret channel which bridges the oceans and will carry him to the Indies. In October 1502, Columbus stops at a place called Chiriqui, in what we now know as Panama. He follows an inland waterway which he believes will take him to the Indian Ocean. Columbus is about to discover whether his theory about the westward passage is right. But the vast waterway comes to an abrupt end. It is just another one of the many huge lagoons common on the Central American coast.
You can be tricked fairly easy by these lagoons because they're so immense, so big, and you can't see the horizon, and you just think it's part of the ocean. And also the waterways that go inland, you think they're just like huge channels, so he was tricked quite often.
But the Indians of Chiriqui offer an important clue. They refer to an overland route to a different ocean, a journey which takes 9 days' march across the mountains. If Columbus takes this route, he will become the first European to reach the Pacific Ocean by traveling west. Standing virtually on the spot where the Panama Canal will be built 3.5 centuries later, Columbus refuses to take the path. He remains convinced that he can still find a sea route to Asia. And he thinks that his crews won't survive a dangerous expedition across unknown lands. But this is the closest Columbus will ever come to solving the riddle of the westward passage. And his refusal is condemning his men to an indefinite period at sea. Japan still lies over 8,000 miles away. The Lost Voyage is about to become a disaster. Columbus's Lost Voyage has taken his crew away from home for over 5 months, and still there is no end in sight. The fleet follow the coast, searching for a route to Japan and China. Many of them are starting to believe it doesn't actually exist. Although they don't know it, they have now circumnavigated the entire Central American rim, an impressive feat, even by today's standards. But still, the westward passage remains elusive. To make matters worse, Columbus has arrived at one of the most inhospitable places on Earth.
The east coast of Panama is probably one of the most humid places in Central America. You have places there with 300 days of rainfall. This is like really a swamp, a huge mangrove forest, and it's probably the worst place for a human to be.
Even today, the area along this coast, known as the Darien Jungle, remains one of the last impenetrable places on Earth.
Everything is wet and soggy and damp. Clothes start rotting in a very short time. Between the rainstorms, the insects come out, the mosquitoes, and of course the diseases get going, the malaria, the fevers, which are endemic along that section of coast.
Columbus recalled how his crew started to give up hope.
The crews were so broken that they prayed for death to give them martyrdom.
Tired, hungry, and in despair, the crews are fast losing any remaining respect for Columbus. All because of his stubborn intent to find the westward passage to the Orient. And for the first time, even Columbus himself begins to doubt that he can succeed. He fears that it is only a matter of time before his crew mutiny.